My name is Eleanor Ellie Carmichael, and I'm 65 years old. I've spent most of my life building something solid, not flashy, raising my son, managing my work, and keeping my small world in order. I've always believed that integrity and effort mattered more than appearances. Tonight, standing in the grand ballroom of a Seattle penthouse, I was about to find out how little that belief mattered to the world my son now inhabited. Ethan's engagement party was in full swing. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above the polished marble floors, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. The scent of roses and expensive champagne filled the air. Guests laughed, clinked glasses, and complimented one another on designer gowns and tailored suits. I felt the familiar tug of self-consciousness, but I adjusted the hem of my simple navy dress, smoothed the front of my blouse, and reminded myself why I was here for my son. Then he said it. "You're an embarrassment. You're not welcome." Ethan's voice cut through the music and chatter like a knife. My chest tightened. I froze for a heartbeat, unsure if the words had actually come from him or if I had imagined them. But the sharp edge of reality hit again as he stepped forward, eyes blazing, his posture perfect and commanding every bit the image of the wealthy man he had become. Around us a few heads turned, some guests, whispering, others staring openly. I realized the entire room had just been drawn into the moment. I felt a surge of heat, a jolt of disbelief, and then, surprisingly, a strange calm settled over me. I smiled carefully, not because I felt any amusement, but because the alternative anger, tears, humiliation would have made his words true in my mind. I tilted my head, letting my gaze meet his steadily, and said nothing. I adjusted my work boots, the same pair I had worn for years, scuffed at the toes, and tried to breathe through the sudden tightness in my throat. The air between us seemed to freeze. Guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing had happened. I watched Ethan, so confident, so sure of the power he believed he wielded. He didn't notice how small he seemed in the enormity of the room, how the words he had spoken would echo in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. I thought briefly of the little boy he had been, of scraped knees, and bedtime stories of the long nights I had spent coaxing him to sleep and making him breakfast before work. That memory struck me harder than his words ever could. For a moment, I simply observed the sparkle of chandeliers reflecting off polished marble, the soft murmur of voices, and the proud, arrogant set of Ethan's shoulders. And then, as quickly as it had struck, the moment began to pass. The music swelled, the conversation resumed, and the party carried on, oblivious to the storm that had passed through the center of the room. I straightened my spine, letting the memory of a lifetime of perseverance anchor me. Tonight had changed nothing in the world I had built, even if it had shifted the world Ethan inhabited. I stepped back slightly, letting him hold the spotlight, and turned my mind inward to the long story of how we had come to this moment and to the choices that had led me here. I remember the first night I held Ethan in my arms after his father passed. The apartment was small, barely enough room for the two of us, with its peeling paint and a single flickering light in the kitchen. I was 35, exhausted from juggling night shifts at the engineering firm and early mornings getting Ethan ready for daycare. Yet the moment I looked at his tiny face, all fatigue vanished. I promised myself then that I would do everything to keep him safe, warm and loved, no matter the cost. Those early years were relentless. Diapers, sleepless nights, and the constant worry about paying rent and keeping the heat on became my new normal. I learned to stretch a dollar until it screamed to navigate the labyrinth of Seattle's bureaucracy for affordable childcare, and to find free weekend activities that would make Ethan's childhood feel magical despite our modest means. I skipped lunches and postponed doctor's appointments, anything to keep him comfortable. There were days I felt invisible to the world, but I never let Ethan see my exhaustion. He deserved my full attention, even if it meant leaving my own needs unmet. I taught him everything I could in that cramped apartment. Alphabet blocks at the kitchen table, bedtime stories that stretched my voice into characters and accents, late-night math problems solved with coffee in one hand and a diaper bag in the other. I cheered at every milestone, his first steps, first words, first day at school. Each smile and laugh he offered me felt like a victory against the relentless tide of loss and hardship. Work was no less demanding. I moved from a junior project coordinator to managing city infrastructure projects, often supervising crews twice my age. The men on the construction sites would joke about my small stature and sharp tongue, but they learned quickly that I demanded excellence. Every bridge I helped design, every street I paved, every neighborhood project I oversaw was not just work. It was a testament to the life I was building for Ethan. I wanted him to grow up knowing that hard work mattered, that character mattered, and that love could withstand even the harshest trials. There were sacrifices I never spoke of. Birthday parties skipped because of deadlines, nights alone in an empty apartment. Friendships that fell away because I had no time to nurture them. I watched other parents leisurely strolling with their children while I calculated overtime hours and grocery bills in my head, and yet never once did I regret it. Each sacrifice was a brick in the foundation of our life, a structure built with sweat, determination, and unyielding love. Ethan grew up in that world, learning resilience and self-reliance without ever seeing the full toll it took on me. I wanted him to thrive, to chase his ambitions without fear, to one day surpass the limitations of our humble apartment and the challenges we endured. I thought that by giving him everything I could, he would understand what it meant to care, to respect, to love deeply. I had no idea how that same love could be tested decades later, in ways I could never have imagined under chandeliers and among the polished faces of Seattle's elite. My name is Eleanor Carmichael, and at 65, my life is far removed from the glittering world my son now inhabits. Each morning, I climb into my old Toyota Tacoma and drive through Seattle's foggy streets to oversee major civil engineering projects, bridges, roadways, and public parks, not from a boardroom, but on site where concrete smells of rain and asphalt fill the air. On the construction sites, I am known as firm but fair. Men and women twice my age may jest about my persistence, but they respect that I know every bolt beam and blueprint. I am not flashy, I am not wealthy, but I am competent. And competence has always mattered more than approval. At home, my life reflects the same simplicity. A modest apartment near Lake Union walls lined with books and photos of Ethan as a boy. Furniture sturdy and practical, and a kitchen stocked with simple meals I cook myself. Routine brings comfort, and the quiet honesty of my surroundings has always grounded me. Yet this simplicity feels alien in Ethan's world. With a $35 million inheritance, he now moves through penthouses, private clubs, and lavish parties, flanked by guests in designer attire and the faint scent of champagne. I, by contrast, arrive in scuffed boots and a navy blazer. The contrast between us is stark. He wields wealth like armor, while I remain tethered to a life defined by decades of hard work and quiet achievement. I catch glimpses of him at these events, noting how he subtly avoids me as if my presence threatens the image he has constructed. He surrounds himself with people who value status and appearances, and he has made an unspoken decision about where I fit, or rather, where I do not. It stings, but it reinforces the pride I have cultivated, a pride independent of anyone else's approval. Driving home, I take comfort in the cityscape bridges I've helped design, streets I've paved. These are lasting accomplishments, enduring in ways flashy parties never could be. In my Tacoma with the hum of tires on asphalt, I remind myself that true value is measured in action and integrity, not wealth or applause. Even as Ethan revels in luxury, I remain the same. Eleanor Carmichael, who once walked him to daycare, bandaged scraped knees, and stayed up late helping with homework. That foundation cannot be shaken by his rejection, his parties, or the polished world he now inhabits. Standing on my balcony, I watch the city lights shimmer on the water, grounding myself in the life I've built. For all its ordinariness, this life is mine, and I will not trade it for status approval or the fleeting admiration of a world that values image over character. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when the call came through. Ethan's voice was crisp and excited, but underneath I could hear the tremor of disbelief he was trying to mask. He had just been informed of a $35 million inheritance left to him by his great-uncle, a distant relative whose fortune had quietly accumulated over decades in real estate and investments. $28 million sat in a trust fund, and $7 million was immediately accessible in cash. It was an astonishing sum, the kind of wealth that changes everything at once, and I could already sense how it would change him. The inheritance, however, was not without its strings. The legal documents carefully drafted by a meticulous law firm in downtown Seattle outlined explicit conditions. Ethan was required to donate $500,000 annually to charitable causes and to maintain respectful, supportive relationships with all surviving family members. Failure to comply could result in immediate review and possible revocation of the inheritance. When I read the clauses, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The money could provide opportunities, yes, but it also demanded responsibility and character qualities I hoped Ethan would honor. Ethan, for his part, was already envisioning a new life. He spoke of moving into a penthouse with panoramic views of Puget Sound, attending exclusive clubs, and surrounding himself with friends who would appreciate the prestige his wealth afforded him. I listened quietly, knowing that wealth, while tempting, often distorts priorities and tests loyalties. I recalled the years of teaching him what truly mattered: hard work, integrity, and respect. Now he would be tempted to measure himself by possessions, status, and appearances instead of the lessons I had instilled. When he arrived at my apartment later that day, his eyes were alight with anticipation. He couldn't wait to show me the plans he had already sketched for how he would live, invest, and spend the money. I nodded and smiled, trying not to dampen his enthusiasm, but I reminded him gently that inheritance was not a gift without expectation. The clauses, the commitments, the oversight, they were designed to preserve values, not merely distribute wealth. I watched him for a long moment, noting the subtle shift in his demeanor. He carried himself differently now, shoulders squared, chin high, as if the world had suddenly expanded to accommodate his newfound fortune. There was a spark of excitement in him, yes, but also an emerging sense of entitlement I hadn't seen before. I felt the weight of what was to come. How quickly this money could alter our relationship. How easily his perspective might shift from the boy I raised to someone unrecognizable. The trust fund was more than just a financial instrument. It was a test of character. It demanded that he honor the past, value his family, and balance ambition with humility. I had hoped that decades of raising him, teaching him respect and empathy, would guide him now. But I also knew that wealth has a way of revealing true priorities. And as Ethan left my apartment that afternoon, already daydreaming about his penthouse and his new life, I understood that our lives were about to change in ways neither of us could fully anticipate. After the inheritance, the change in Ethan was subtle at first, but unmistakable. He began arriving late to dinners, lingering on calls with friends I didn't know, and dismissing the small moments we once shared. The warmth between us thinned, replaced by cautious politeness that barely concealed discomfort. It started with small things. At his birthday dinner, he seated me at the far end of the table, near the window, away from the guests he now considered peers. When I passed the bread, he hesitated glancing at the polished silverware and candles, as if my touch were out of place. His friends offered polite smiles, oblivious to the history unfolding quietly. The tension reminded me of my early days on construction sites when others doubted a woman could lead. At cocktail parties, the shift became more pronounced. Ethan introduced me as family in clipped tones, emphasizing my role in his upbringing rather than my accomplishments. I kept to the periphery. My laughter muted my compliments, brief feeling the subtle looks, the straightening of his posture, when I entered, whispered remarks to his friends. I had raised him to value character over appearance, yet appearances now dictated his world, and I did not fit. The first overt avoidance came at a fundraiser for a school I had helped renovate. Ethan arrived in a sleek black SUV, the scent of leather and expensive cologne announcing him. He nodded tightly at me, a smile that did not reach his eyes, and mingled with donors, while I lingered by the refreshments table. The boy I had nurtured, the one who clung to my arm on his first day of school, was distancing himself not only emotionally, but physically. At family events, he began making subtle public jokes about my plain meals, practical clothing, and worn truck, claiming my modest lifestyle was charming in a nostalgic way. The words stung. Wealth had not just given him opportunity, it had created a new hierarchy, and I was now judged by a lens I could not control. I tried small gestures, calls, shared memories, coffee, but each time he retreated further into a world that measured worth by bank statements and appearances. The collision of love and social ambition left me disoriented and silent. Each evening alone in my modest apartment overlooking the Seattle skyline, I replayed the interactions, reflecting on years of sacrifices and sleepless nights, comforting a frightened child. The inheritance had done more than alter finances. It was reshaping our relationship, showing how easily love could clash with image, and how quietly distance could grow between two people who once shared everything. The realization settled like fog over Lake Union. Nothing would be the same. Yet beneath the ache, I carried a quiet certainty that I would not let this distance define me, or the love I had spent a lifetime cultivating. I found Ethan in the corner of his new penthouse, staring out at the city lights that glittered like spilled jewels across Seattle. The place smelled faintly of expensive leather and polished wood, a scent I had never associated with him before. He didn't turn when I entered, and I could see the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he carried himself now confident but detached, as if wealth had built an invisible wall around him. "Ethan," I began gently, "we need to talk about the inheritance." He didn't look at me, but I could feel the shift in the air, that delicate balance between attention and dismissal that he had perfected. "I know, Mom," he said casually, his tone clipped. "I've read the documents." I moved closer, placing my hands on the railing near him. "Reading them isn't enough. You need to understand what they mean. This money isn't just about numbers, it comes with responsibilities. Charitable donations, maintaining respectful relationships with family. These aren't suggestions, Ethan. They're conditions." He finally turned, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile that carried more arrogance than warmth. "I get it, Mom. I don't need a lecture." The familiar ache of disappointment settled in my chest, the one I had felt so many times over the years when he dismissed a lesson I had painstakingly taught. I drew a deep breath. "I'm not lecturing. I'm warning you. The conditions are strict. If you disregard them, you could lose everything even before you've had a chance to enjoy it. This money is meant to be a tool, not a trophy." Ethan leaned back. Arms crossed the cityscape, reflecting in his eyes. "Mom, I appreciate your concern, really, but I know what I'm doing. I've got this under control." I wanted to shake him, to make him feel the weight of what he was ignoring. "You don't understand." I pressed softer this time because shouting wouldn't reach him. "This isn't about control. It's about respect. Respect for your family, for the people who came before you, and for yourself. The inheritance is conditional because it's meant to guide your choices to test your character, not just your ambition. He shrugged a gesture that spoke volumes, more than words ever could. I'll be fine. I've worked hard, Mom. I deserve this. I'll handle it my way. I felt a pang of helplessness, remembering all the times I had guided him through real hardships, all the nights I had stayed awake worrying over small decisions that mattered to his safety and well-being. And now faced with this enormous responsibility, he dismissed my advice with the same casual confidence that made me proud and terrified all at once. I tried one last appeal, my voice calm but firm. Ethan, you can't ignore the terms. If you fail even once, the consequences are immediate. It's not about wealth. It's about your integrity. Please listen to me. Take this seriously. He nodded, or at least gave the semblance of it, and turned back to the view. I realized then that my words had reached only the surface. The boy I raised, the one who had clung to me in the dark of a hospital room after his father died, had been replaced by a man enamored with the idea of wealth and freedom. I left him there, the city lights casting long shadows across his face, knowing that warnings ignored would come with consequences far heavier than either of us could yet imagine. After that evening in the penthouse, I realized I could no longer rely on words alone. Ethan's confidence, his careless dismissal of responsibility, had created a distance that conversation could not bridge. If he was going to be held accountable, if the terms of the inheritance were to mean anything, I would need proof, concrete, undeniable proof that his behavior had violated the conditions laid out in the trust. I began quietly, almost imperceptibly, gathering every scrap of evidence I could find. Text messages were the first step. I scrolled through old threads where he casually belittled me in front of friends, calling my career humble or outdated, laughing about my wardrobe, my practical shoes, and even the worn leather of my truck. Each line carried a sting, but I saved every one. Screenshots carefully labeled with dates became the foundation of what I was compiling. Next came photographs. I had kept my phone in my pocket during events, discreetly capturing moments that spoke volumes. There were pictures of him introducing me to acquaintances as the help at a charity gala, angles carefully chosen, so I appeared peripheral, almost invisible. Another shot caught him rolling his eyes as I accepted a handshake from an important donor, my smile polite, measured, while he stood a few feet away, ensuring no one mistook our relationship for warmth or intimacy. Each image reinforced a pattern, a repeated disregard for respect and acknowledgement. Recordings added another layer. I had quietly started recording our interactions, beginning with casual phone calls, then progressing to more structured conversations during events. His voice, confident and unapologetic, admitted the very sentiments he later tried to disguise behind politeness or charm. When he explained away my presence at social gatherings as old-fashioned or embarrassing, those moments were captured and cataloged. They were not contrived or exaggerated. They were his words spoken in public or private, revealing a consistent pattern of behavior over time. Compiling everything into folders, labeled meticulously by date, event, and context, I felt a mix of resolve and sorrow. This was my son, the boy I had raised through sleepless nights and scraped knees, now revealed in a side of himself that I had feared would emerge, the man who equated love with approval, family with social standing, and respect with status. It was painful to watch even through the lens of evidence. Yet I reminded myself why I was doing it. The inheritance was not merely about money. It was about upholding values, safeguarding a legacy that had been entrusted to both of us. If Ethan could not respect those conditions willingly, then the law and documentation would serve as the guide he refused to follow. Every text, every photo, every recording was a brick in the wall I was quietly building, not to punish him, but to preserve the principles I had spent decades instilling. Even as I worked late into the night reviewing and organizing, I remained conscious of the emotional weight. Collecting evidence was not a game. It was a form of defense, a way to protect my dignity and the integrity of our family. There were nights I found myself hesitating over a text or a photo, feeling the tension between my love for him and the reality of his choices. I had to reconcile that love with accountability, and each click of the mouse, each file saved, was a step toward that reconciliation. By the time the first folder was complete, I could see the pattern with absolute clarity. Ethan's disregard had been consistent, escalating, and increasingly public. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted, and realized that this archive was more than evidence. It was a reflection of the distance that had grown between us, a map of how privilege and pride had begun to overshadow the son I had once known. I shut my laptop and let out a long, measured breath. I knew that soon this evidence would need to serve its purpose, to confront him with reality in a way that words alone never could. And as I looked out the window at the city lights twinkling against the night sky, I felt a quiet determination settle over me. I would not allow my years, my sacrifices, or my dignity to be dismissed. If the path forward required proof, I was ready to gather all of it without compromise. The night before the engagement party, I asked Ethan to meet me at a quiet cafe tucked between the high-rises of downtown Seattle. It was almost empty, save for a barista polishing glasses and a couple huddled over steaming mugs. I chose it deliberately neutral ground, no glitz, no witnesses, no distractions. He arrived precisely on time, crisp, in a tailored navy blazer, the corners of his mouth lifted in that familiar, practiced smile. But the warmth was gone. I studied him carefully, noting the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. The excitement of his newfound fortune and social world had created a distance I wasn't sure I could bridge with conversation alone. "Thank you for meeting me," I said softly, sitting down across from him. "I know you're busy preparing for tomorrow." He nodded, glancing at the city lights outside the cafe window, his attention focused on the horizon rather than me. "Of course, Mom. What's so urgent that we have to do this tonight?" I let a moment pass, gathering my thoughts. "Ethan, I need you to understand the seriousness of the inheritance. The money comes with conditions. Charitable contributions, maintaining respectful relationships with family. You can't ignore these. They aren't just suggestions, they are legal obligations." He finally turned his gaze toward me, calm but guarded. "Mom, I know what you're going to say. I've read the documents and I get it. Really, I do. You don't need to lecture me." I kept my voice steady, careful not to let frustration creep in. "I'm not lecturing. I'm warning you. I've spent a lifetime trying to teach you the difference between responsibility and entitlement. You can't dismiss this, Ethan. If you fail to follow these conditions, the consequences are immediate and irreversible. You could lose everything." He leaned back, crossing his arms, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I appreciate the concern, Mom, but I can handle it. I've got it under control." The smirk cut deeper than any harsh words could. He sounded so sure, so untouchable, as if decades of caution and patience, my sacrifices, my guidance meant nothing in the face of his confidence. I took a slow breath, letting the memory of his childhood anchor me, scraped knees, bedside stories, the nights I held him as he cried from fever or fear. That boy had trusted me completely, and now the man had closed himself off with arrogance. "I'm asking you to think beyond yourself," I pressed gently, keeping my tone calm but firm. "This isn't just about money. It's about integrity, about respect for your family, and for the people who came before you. The inheritance was intended to guide you, to test your character, not just your ambition." He shook his head slightly, a gesture meant to dismiss, and then smiled again, carefully, neutral. "Mom, I know you mean well, but I'll manage. I don't need guidance right now. Tomorrow is the party and I've got everything planned, you'll see." I felt a sharp pang of helplessness, a recognition that my words alone would not reach him. "Ethan," I said softly, "please consider what you're risking. This isn't about control or approval. It's about the life you want to build and the values you carry with you. Don't let pride blind you." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and then turned back toward the window, already disengaging from the conversation. I watched him for a long moment, seeing the boy I raised buried beneath layers of entitlement and ambition. As we left the cafe, I felt the weight of what was to come. The engagement party would be the first public test of his choices, and despite my warnings, I knew that pride and arrogance might overshadow reason. Yet I could only prepare myself, gather my resolve, and hope that honesty, even in its quietest form, might find its way through the walls he had built. The day of the engagement party, I stood outside the towering glass facade of Ethan's penthouse, the rain-slicked sidewalks reflecting the neon glow of Seattle's skyline. I took a deep breath and adjusted the hem of my navy blazer. My dress was simple, my shoes practical, my hair neatly pinned back. I had spent the morning rehearsing how to move through the crowd without drawing attention, though I knew that in a room full of 200 guests, some attention was inevitable. As I stepped into the lobby, the grandeur struck me. Polished marble floors stretched beneath a sweeping crystal staircase, and the air was perfumed with roses and the faint hint of expensive cologne. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided past trays laden with sparkling glasses of champagne. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled their laughter, clipped and precise voices carrying the weight of pedigree and wealth. I felt the familiar pull of self-consciousness, but held my head high, letting decades of composure guide me. Ethan met me at the entrance. His smile rehearsed his posture, immaculate. He wore a charcoal suit that fit perfectly, every crease in place, a thin gold watch glinting at his wrist. "Mom," he said, his voice polite but distant. "You made it." "Yes," I replied quietly, letting my eyes take in the room. "Of course I did." He guided me toward the main ballroom past clusters of guests, discussing stock options, charity boards, and the latest real estate developments. The contrast between us was immediate and stark. I, a woman who had spent 65 years building her life from hard work and integrity, moved through the space with quiet dignity. He, surrounded by wealth and elegance, had perfected the art of fitting in, carefully curating every gesture to signal success and taste. The chandeliers cast 1,000 reflections across the polished floors, and I noticed the subtle glances directed toward me, some curious, some polite, and some thinly veiled judgment. Ethan introduced me in clipped terms. "This is my mother, Eleanor," with no mention of my accomplishments, no recognition of the life I had built, or the values I had instilled. The words cut deeper than I expected. I smiled politely at the guests, offering a handshake here, a nod there, keeping my movements graceful, restrained. As I navigated through the crowd, I felt the weight of my presence, or perhaps the perceived lack of it. Here in this room, status spoke louder than decades of work, and appearances carried more weight than character. I saw Ethan chatting with investors, nodding at compliments on his suit, his new car, his anticipated penthouse view. Every detail of his life broadcast success, carefully constructed and displayed for admiration. And yet, he failed to see the irony. The woman who had raised him, guided him, sacrificed everything, now seemed invisible in his meticulously curated world. I found a quiet corner near the balcony and paused, letting my gaze drift over the city lights and the assembly of polished faces. I reminded myself that integrity was not measured by applause by designer labels or by the nods of strangers. The foundation of a life, the strength of one's character, does not shimmer in chandeliers. It is built quietly in countless choices made over decades. Ethan approached me again, gently taking my elbow. "We should mingle," he said, smiling, though the warmth was absent. I nodded, adjusting my posture, and followed him into the throng. Every step reminded me of the delicate balance I would have to maintain tonight, present but unobtrusive, dignified but ready, honest but patient. The engagement party had begun, and with it, the first public test of all the warnings I had given him. Amid the glitter and laughter, the clinking glasses, and the subtle judgments, I felt the familiar resolve settle over me. No matter the world he had stepped into, I was determined to remain anchored in the truth of who I was and the lessons I had taught him long before the inheritance had changed everything. The music swelled in the main ballroom, a smooth jazz quartet, filling the air while guests mingled their laughter crisp and rehearsed. I moved carefully among the clusters of impeccably dressed people, offering nods and polite smiles, feeling the subtle weight of their scrutiny. Then Ethan appeared beside me, his expression composed, almost serene, as if the city itself had paused for his arrival. "Mom," he said quietly, leaning close, "there's something you need to see." Before I could respond, he handed me a small embossed card. I glanced down. Sarah Mitchell, image consultant for Seattle's elite, $500 per session. I blinked, taken aback by the audacity. "Ethan?" I began, keeping my voice calm. "What is this?" He smiled, though it lacked warmth. "Mom, you need some help fitting in. You can't go to these events as yourself. You need to dress appropriately, learn the etiquette, maybe even present yourself differently in conversation. People notice, Mom. They notice everything." I lifted my gaze to his, searching for any hint of humor, of mischief, anything that would make this feel like a joke. There was none. The clarity of his seriousness made the blood drain from my face, but I didn't show it. I set the card on the marble table between us, letting my hands linger near it. "Ethan, I don't need someone to teach me how to exist in a room." He shrugged a practiced motion that seemed effortless. "I'm serious, Mom. This isn't about being critical, it's about survival. If you want to be part of this world, to maintain the image you have, to do more than just show up, people have expectations. I can't have you embarrassing me." My chest tightened. The word embarrass struck deep, echoing the countless times he had expressed subtle, sometimes overt disappointment in my life choices, now amplified by the presence of his wealthy peers. I remembered the nights I stayed awake, worrying about his future, guiding him toward independence and responsibility, teaching him the value of integrity. And now that same integrity, my very self, was apparently insufficient. "I've spent a lifetime building my life honestly, Ethan," I said, my voice steady, despite the flutter of heat in my chest. "I've raised you, managed my work, and created a career of which I am proud. I don't need someone to coach me into pretending to be someone I am not." He folded his arms, leaning slightly, and the faintest crease appeared between his brows. "Mom, you don't understand. It's not personal. This world doesn't care about your achievements. It cares about appearances. If you want to exist in it, you have to adapt. You need to learn to present yourself the way people expect, not the way you are." I felt a quiet, simmering rage tempered by years of measured composure. I wanted to shake him, to make him understand the depth of my disappointment, the audacity of reducing decades of work sacrifice and character to a fashion lesson. But I didn't. Instead, I let my gaze travel around the room, observing the chatter, the carefully orchestrated conversations, the polite but calculating smiles. I saw the way he moved among the guests, the ease with which he inhabited a world I had never asked to enter. I returned my attention to him, letting the silence stretch. "Ethan," I said finally, "I am not an image. I am Eleanor Carmichael. I have never pretended otherwise, and I will not start now." He looked at me, a flicker of frustration passing through his expression, but he said nothing. The card remained between us, a small rectangle of arrogance and expectation, and I realized that this confrontation was only the beginning. Tonight, I would stand as myself in the quiet dignity of my life and my choices unbending, uncompromised. The party continued around us, oblivious to the tension that had just passed between mother and son, but I felt the stakes settle firmly into place. Whatever came next, I knew that honesty, my honesty, would be the measure against which everything else would be judged. The ballroom buzzed with conversation, the soft clink of glasses punctuating the elegant chatter. I stood near the balcony watching Ethan move effortlessly among the guests, his tailored suit impeccable. The room gleamed with practiced elegance, a world far removed from mine, yet I knew this was the moment to reclaim the authority I had earned over decades. Ethan approached, smiling, as if expecting me to follow his lead. "Mom, I want you to meet some people, important friends, potential investors. Just try to follow the etiquette I mentioned." I raised an eyebrow. "Try to follow the etiquette," I repeated calmly. "Ethan, I've spent a lifetime negotiating contracts, managing teams of hundreds, and overseeing projects that reshape this city. I think I can manage a conversation without a consultant." His smile faltered. The guests nearby leaned in curious, sensing the shift. I moved closer to Ethan, my voice quiet, but deliberate. "I am Eleanor Carmichael, CEO of Carmichael Construction Group. We oversee the largest infrastructure projects in Seattle, from bridges to highways. We touch lives, influence neighborhoods, and manage billions in contracts. I built this company from the ground up and run it every day." A pause fell over the room. Ethan's jaw tightened, his confidence wavering. Murmurs spread among the guests, their polite shock evident. A woman whispered to her companion. A man nodded slowly, absorbing the unexpected truth. Ethan's narrative that my simplicity reflected insignificance was crumbling before him. I continued, letting decades of labor and dedication carry my words. "Tonight, I am here as myself. I do not need to dress or act to please anyone but myself. The work I do, the lives I impact, the teams I lead, these are my credentials, not the color of my shoes or the cut of my dress." Guests shifted, some nodding subtly, others exchanging astonished glances. The room's energy changed. The balance of power, subtle yet undeniable, shifted. Ethan looked around, uncertainty flickering in his eyes as cracks appeared in his polished social world. "You see, Ethan?" I lowered my voice, so only he could hear. "Success is not measured by appearances or approval. It's measured by competence, integrity, and the tangible impact of your work. I have lived by that standard and will not compromise it for social convenience." His lips parted, caught between protest and awe. The murmurs confirmed the silent acknowledgement the woman he had underestimated, dismissed, and tried to ignore was formidable. My power was subtle, earned, undeniable. Ethan glanced at the room, noting the subtle shifts in perception. I stepped back slightly, letting my presence settle. This was not revenge or spectacle, it was truth revealed. The story he had relied on, that I was a modest mother out of place, was gone, replaced by reality. The evening had irrevocably changed, not just for him, but for everyone who assumed they knew who I was. I watched him, knowing the lessons of humility, diligence, and respect would now confront the world he had chosen and the power he had underestimated. I was just stepping back from a cluster of curious guests when my phone vibrated in my clutch. The name on the screen made my heart skip a beat. Margaret Davis, the attorney who had handled my late husband's estate and advised me on the inheritance documents years ago. "Ms. Carmichael," Margaret said crisply, when I answered, her tone measured but urgent. "I've reviewed everything you've compiled. The evidence is clear. Ethan has repeatedly violated the terms of the inheritance." I felt the tension in my chest tighten. "I know," I said quietly, gripping the phone a little tighter. "I've documented every instance, every text, every public slight. He doesn't realize the consequences yet. There's no room for leniency this time," Margaret continued. "The clauses are explicit. Section 7 requires respectful relationships with surviving family members, and Section 12, addresses public disrespect or humiliation. Ethan has breached both. If the Inheritance Committee acts, he could lose the full $35 million, both the trust and the cash distribution. I drew a steadying breath, letting the weight of the situation settle over me. It was not revenge I sought, nor punishment for its own sake. This was accountability. The inheritance had conditions for a reason, and they were designed to uphold values Ethan seemed to have set aside in favor of social image. Margaret's voice cut through my thoughts again. You'll need to prepare for a formal review. The committee will require all documentation. Your texts, photos, and recordings will form the basis for the assessment. They will be notified immediately. Ethan will have a chance to respond, but given the pattern, I cannot foresee leniency. I nodded, though she could not see me. I had expected as much. The meticulous record-keeping, the months of preparation, the careful cataloging of every slight, it was all in anticipation of this moment. My chest tightened with a mixture of dread and resolve. This confrontation, public or private, was inevitable. Margaret, I said, voice low but firm, do we move forward now? I want to ensure this is handled correctly without exaggeration or theatrics. I've documented the truth, nothing more. That's the right approach, she replied. We present facts. He will be held to the terms he agreed to when he inherited the funds. Your evidence is sufficient. Once the committee convenes, any violation will trigger immediate review and possible revocation. Ethan's actions, especially given their public nature, leave little room for argument. I felt the tension of the party behind me, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the oblivious guests, and contrasted it with the gravity of what was unfolding. Ethan was unaware that his choices had led us here, that the very privileges he flaunted were contingent on behavior he had neglected. Pride and arrogance had carried him this far, but rules once enforced do not bend for confidence or charm. Margaret continued, You will be asked to appear at the committee meeting, and your documentation will be reviewed in full. Ethan will have one final chance to acknowledge the breaches, but any delay or denial will result in forfeiture of all assets. I exhaled slowly, letting the reality sink in. The inheritance was more than money. It was a test of character and judgment. And now the reckoning was in motion. My son, confident and composed just moments ago, was about to face the consequences of a pattern he could no longer dismiss or ignore. As I hung up, I straightened my back and scanned the room. Ethan laughed and gestured animatedly with his friends, unaware of the legal storm that had just been set into motion. Pride, it seemed, could survive in his mind, but it was about to collide with rules and accountability in a way he had never anticipated. I felt a quiet determination settle over me. Honesty, evidence, and integrity would be the measure of tonight's outcome. The ballroom shimmered with crystal and candlelight, the conversations weaving a gentle hum beneath the soft strains of a string quartet. I moved among the guests, offering nods and polite smiles, all while keeping a careful eye on Ethan. He was magnetic tonight, laughing easily, making introductions, charming the crowd, the very image of a successful, confident man. But beneath the charm, I felt the tension tightening, a storm I had been anticipating building silently in the space between us. Ethan approached me suddenly, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder as if to guide me through the gathering. "Mom," he said softly, drawing the attention of a nearby couple, "we need to talk. Right now." I followed, aware of the gaze of several guests and the quiet shift in the room as whispers began to circulate. He led me to the edge of the balcony overlooking the city lights, a few curious glances darting toward us. "Ethan," I said quietly, "we've already spoken. This isn't the time or the place." He shook his head, his jaw tight. "No, this is exactly the time, Mom. Everyone should understand where we stand. His voice carried a firmness that drew immediate attention. Guests near the railing caused glasses half raised, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. I looked at him, steadying myself, and said, "Ethan, you know the conditions. You know what's expected. There's no need to make this public." He let out a short, humorless laugh, one that carried across the balcony. "You think I care about conditions. This inheritance, the money, it's mine, and I don't need to show respect or gratitude to anyone. Not here, not now, not ever." The words landed like a stone thrown into calm water. A few nearby guests froze mid-conversation. Others leaned slightly forward, curiosity sharpening their expressions. The quiet music seemed to fade, replaced by the echo of Ethan's declaration. I took a deep breath, feeling the surge of disappointment, shock, and an old familiar ache. He had transformed over the past months into someone almost unrecognizable, a man who had built walls of pride between us. And now, in front of friends, acquaintances, and strangers, he made the ultimate display of defiance. "I've spent my life teaching you the difference between responsibility and entitlement," I said, my voice calm but firm, carrying over the balcony to reach him directly. "You cannot discard what was entrusted to you, not without consequences. This inheritance is not just about wealth, it's about character, integrity, and respect. You are failing in all three publicly." He tilted his head, eyes sharp, unyielding. "Character, integrity, respect." He repeated each word, dripping with condescension. "Those are your rules, Mom, not mine. I've earned what I have, and I answer to no one for how I handle it. Especially not to the woman who raised me in a world I've long outgrown." Gasps rippled through the few guests who had drawn close enough to overhear. Whispers spread, eyes flicking between us. Ethan's confidence was absolute, his public dismissal a masterclass in social dominance, at least from the perspective of the naive or uninformed observer. I could feel the heat of anger, humiliation, and resolve all at once, a combination that had sharpened over years of watching him grow into someone increasingly self-absorbed. I did not move, did not raise my voice, but I let him see the calm behind my eyes, the steel forged from decades of sacrifice experience and unshakable integrity. "You are mistaken if you believe arrogance and status can replace respect," I said quietly, letting the words resonate. "Tonight, you have chosen pride over responsibility, and the consequences will follow, not as punishment from me, but as the natural result of your decisions." Ethan's lips pressed together, his gaze flicking briefly toward the city skyline, but he did not relent. The crowd, sensing the tension, began to shift, murmurs carrying through the ballroom. For the first time that night, I felt the absolute clarity of stakes. Pride unchecked had collided with responsibility, and neither could walk away without change. I stepped back, letting him hold the spotlight, knowing that this moment, charged and irreversible, would define the next chapter of both our lives. The party continued around us, but for Ethan and me, the confrontation had reached its apex, and the consequences, though unspoken, were already in motion. The morning after the engagement party, the repercussions of Ethan's public defiance unfolded with relentless precision. I sat in my modest Seattle apartment watching the city wake beneath a gray sky, a cup of coffee warming my hands. The phone rang incessantly, but I let it ring, knowing that each call carried news I had anticipated yet dreaded. By mid-morning, Margaret Davis, my lawyer, arrived with a stack of documents thicker than I had expected. Her expression was calm, professional, yet the weight of authority in her eyes made it clear the committee had acted swiftly. Every detail, every clause of the inheritance agreement had been invoked without hesitation. Ethan's actions, his public dismissal, his disregard for the trust conditions had triggered immediate review and revocation. The first notices went out that very hour. The penthouse that Ethan had so proudly reserved was now in foreclosure proceedings, the bank issuing instructions for repossession. I could imagine the message being delivered, the glossy doors of his luxury home sliding closed as movers and legal officers began the process. It was a clean, irreversible procedure, and no amount of protest or charm could alter the outcome. Next, the credit cards tied to the inheritance were canceled. I thought of the small conveniences he had taken for granted, the designer purchases, the reservations, the extravagant dinners, and the sudden reality that those privileges were no longer his. The committee had ensured that every asset obtained under the inheritance was subject to immediate reclamation, even the club memberships. The badges of social status were terminated for non-payment, sending a clear message: privilege without responsibility carries no protection. Margaret handed me a document detailing the full financial picture. The $28 million trust was frozen pending final reassessment, the $7 million in cash to be returned or redirected according to the estate's discretion. She looked at me with quiet certainty. This is exactly what was outlined in the clauses. Actions have consequences. Ethan will have to answer for every choice, and the results are irreversible unless he can demonstrate immediate compliance with the trust's conditions. I could feel a strange mixture of relief and sadness settle over me. Relief that the principles I had fought to uphold were being enforced. Sadness because my son, the boy I had raised and loved, was learning a harsh lesson in a way that might scar him. Yet even amidst the upheaval, I recognized the inevitability. Pride, arrogance, and neglect of responsibility had consequences, and those consequences were now tangible, visible, and public. By noon, the notices had been delivered. I imagined Ethan mid-conversation with his friends, checking his messages, only to find the stark reality of his losses laid bare: the penthouse, the luxury car, the credit privileges, the club memberships, all repossessed or canceled. The financial freedom he had flaunted was gone, stripped away by the very conditions he had ignored. Margaret advised me to remain composed, to let the legal process run its course, and to allow the consequences to teach their lesson. She reminded me that the inheritance had never been about wealth alone. It was about character, respect, and accountability. By enforcing the clauses immediately, the committee had made clear that actions, not titles or money, define responsibility. I stepped out onto my apartment balcony, looking over Lake Union as the morning mist drifted along the water. The city moved on, unaware of the storm that had just swept through one wealthy household. I sipped my coffee, the warmth grounding me, and felt the weight of what had been set into motion. Ethan would have to navigate the aftermath, face the reality of his choices, and reckon with the consequences of his pride. For the first time in weeks, I felt a quiet sense of resolution. The inheritance had been intended to guide him, to test him, and now it had. Whether he recovered from this or learned from it was uncertain, but the accountability was undeniable, immediate, and irreversible. Ethan spent the following days in a quiet, almost stunned state. The news of the inheritance revocation had spread quickly, and his carefully constructed world of privilege and admiration had begun to crumble. For the first time, he was confronted not with social applause, but with the weight of accountability, and it unsettled him in ways that money and charm never could. I watched from a distance as he moved through the city, no longer with the confident stride of entitlement, but with a hesitant gait, as if each step reminded him of the consequences he had triggered. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations to lunch or meetings were declined. Instead, he spent hours alone scrolling through messages and emails, reading the words that once seemed inconsequential, now heavy with consequence. When he finally called, his voice was quieter than I had heard in years. "Mom," he said, I didn't realize." He paused, the hesitation revealing the struggle between ego and reflection. "I didn't understand how my actions would affect you, or how seriously the conditions mattered." I listened, letting him speak, allowing the weight of his confession to fill the space. He spoke of pride, of wanting to impress his friends, of fearing judgment for his family's modest means. He admitted that he had believed appearances could substitute for character, that status could overshadow respect. And now, confronted with the loss of the inheritance and the reality of his behavior, he was beginning to grasp the error. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he continued, voice tinged with guilt. "I thought I was building a life, a reputation, but I've neglected what matters most: family integrity, respect. I see that now. I see how wrong I was." I remained silent, allowing him to confront his mistakes fully. There was no relief in rushing to absolve him, no satisfaction in gloating over his embarrassment. This was about recognition, about understanding the depth of what he had disregarded. The inheritance, the parties, the status, it was all secondary to the lessons he had ignored for so long. Over the next few days, he began small acts of restitution. He returned calls to family members he had ignored, offered apologies for public slights, and quietly inquired about matters he had previously dismissed. There was an awkward humility in his tone, a recognition that respect is earned, not demanded, and that privileges granted without responsibility are fragile and fleeting. I watched him wrestle with shame and accountability, the boy I had raised now grappling with the man he had become. He visited the local nonprofit I had long supported, volunteering in small ways, engaging with staff and children in a manner that reflected sincerity rather than obligation. Slowly, he began to understand that wealth is fleeting, but character endures, that influence without integrity is hollow, and that mistakes, once recognized, require honest effort to mend. One evening, as we sat across from each other at a modest cafe, Ethan looked at me, eyes steady and sober. "Mom," he said, "I need to change. I want to do better. Not because I want the inheritance back. Not because anyone is watching, but because I want to be someone I can respect." I reached across the table, letting him feel the steadiness of my hand. "That's a start," I said gently. "Change isn't measured by wealth or status. It's measured by the choices you make and the consistency with which you honor them." For the first time in weeks, I saw him truly reflect, truly absorb the weight of his actions. It was not immediate redemption, but the beginnings of understanding, of remorse, and of rebuilding. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, I felt a flicker of hope. The foundation of character once recognized and nurtured could be restored, even after pride and arrogance had led him astray. Weeks after the engagement party, Ethan began to navigate the new reality of his life. Gone were the penthouse views, the designer suits, and the club memberships he had once flaunted. In their place, he found himself walking into a small office tucked into a quiet Seattle neighborhood, the nonprofit where he had agreed to volunteer, now offering him a part-time administrative position. It was modest, functional, and entirely devoid of the trappings he had once equated with success. He arrived early on his first day, arriving on foot, instead of a sleek car, wearing simple slacks and a collared shirt. I met him at the door, observing the subtle tension in his movements, the mix of hesitation and determination that comes with entering unfamiliar territory. There was no bravado, no attempt to impress, only a tentative willingness to engage in honest work. "I'm glad you decided to take this step," I said quietly, keeping my tone neutral but supportive. "It's not about the money, Ethan. It's about learning responsibility, integrity, and self-reliance. These are things money cannot teach." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I know, Mom, I think I understand now more than I ever did before." His gaze dropped for a moment, the weight of recent events pressing on him before he looked back up. "I'm ready to start over the right way this time." Over the following weeks, I watched him immerse himself in the work. He filed documents, organized community events, and assisted with scholarship applications for underprivileged children. It was meticulous, sometimes tedious work, but each task offered him lessons in patience, humility, and the satisfaction of tangible accomplishment. He began to understand that true value comes from effort and care, not appearances or inherited wealth. At the same time, I maintained my boundaries. I allowed our interactions to be measured, deliberate, and grounded in respect. We spent quiet afternoons discussing projects, reviewing his progress, or sharing a simple lunch. Each moment reinforced that reconciliation was possible, but only if mutual respect was sustained. I was cautiously aware that the fragility of our relationship required care, yet I remained open to rebuilding what pride and arrogance had fractured. One evening, as we left the office together, Ethan paused and looked at me with a tentative smile. "Mom, thank you for not giving up on me entirely. I know I have a long way to go, but I want to make it right." I smiled back, a mixture of relief and guarded hope. "You've taken the first steps, Ethan. The rest is up to you, and I'll be here observing, guiding when necessary, but not controlling. Growth cannot be rushed or forced. Respect must be earned and maintained every day." He nodded, a subtle understanding passing between us. It was quiet, unremarkable in appearance, but profound in significance. For the first time in months, I felt the tentative restoration of trust and the fragile, budding potential of a renewed bond. As we walked down the tree-lined street toward the bus stop, I realized that this was not a return to the life we had before. It was something new, a cautious, deliberate rebuilding of character, respect, and connection. In the simplicity of the moment, the modest pace, the ordinary surroundings, I recognized that real change had begun. And for the first time in years, I felt a cautious optimism that our relationship could heal, grounded in understanding effort and earned respect. I sat quietly in my apartment, the late afternoon sunlight spilling across the wooden floor, warming the familiar edges of my modest home. For decades, this space had been my sanctuary, the foundation for the life I had built with care, diligence, and integrity. Now, after the storm of the inheritance, the public confrontation, and the slow rebuilding of my relationship with Ethan, it felt even more like a place of reflection and perspective. I thought back over the months, over the years really, of lessons hard-earned through experience. Wealth can open doors, yes, but it cannot guarantee character. Privilege can demand attention, but it cannot demand respect. True legacy is measured not in dollars or luxury, but in the choices we make, the values we uphold, and the dignity with which we live. My life, my career, my sacrifices, these were my measures of accomplishment. And they had held firm even when the world, or at least my son, seemed to value something else. Ethan had changed. Slowly, painstakingly, he had begun to understand that the world does not revolve around appearances, inherited fortune, or social status. The nonprofit work, the modest responsibilities he had embraced, were teaching him lessons no classroom or boardroom could offer. He was learning accountability, patience, and the tangible satisfaction of contributing to something meaningful, of earning respect rather than expecting it. Watching him navigate this transformation filled me with a quiet pride that no financial figure could ever replicate. I reflected on the moments that had led us here, the warnings ignored, the public defiance, the legal intervention. None of it had been easy, and I had carried the emotional weight of each decision. But each challenge had reinforced the principles I held dear. Ethan had experienced the consequences of pride unchecked, and through that, he was discovering humility and self-awareness. The inheritance had been more than money. It had been a test, a crucible, in which the values I had instilled were confronted with reality. I allowed myself a soft smile, remembering the tentative exchanges over coffee, the quiet walks to the nonprofit office, the small but profound gestures of acknowledgement and apology. Reconciliation had not been instantaneous, nor had it erased the past, but it had created a foundation for something enduring. Trust, respect, and understanding were slowly returning, nurtured by consistent effort and genuine reflection. As I gazed out the window at the city below, lights beginning to twinkle against the early evening sky, I felt a sense of closure settle over me. I had done all I could to guide, to teach, to protect not just Ethan, but the integrity of the principles I cherished. The rest, the shaping of character and legacy, was in his hands now. I stood and straightened my back, feeling the quiet strength of years of perseverance. My life, my choices, my example, they were my true inheritance, and they had endured. Ethan would continue to grow, learn and shape his path, but the foundation of respect, integrity, and character remained unshakable. In that stillness, I realized that the legacy we leave is measured not in wealth, not in appearances, but in the values we embody and the respect we earn through a lifetime of principled choices. And with that understanding, I felt a profound peace, knowing that my story and the lessons within it would endure far beyond any inheritance.